one biochemical process goes into the other, and somewhere there is vitamin B1, and somewhere in there is calcium, and somewhere in there is copper and B6 and B12 and vitamin A and C. Everything is connected. And you take one of those cogs out and the whole system will fall apart, which we didn't have that until we started really interfering with these biological processes that we didn't even know that they existed.
The Biological Farming RoundTable podcast helps farmers explore innovative, low-input, regenerative and profitable farming systems. The Biological Farming RoundTable is sponsored by Nutrisoil, an award-winning biological liquid fertiliser made from a big worm farm. Nutrisoil's purpose is to empower farmers to produce life-enriching food. My name is Nakala Maddock. I work at Nutrisoil. I envisage a future where farmers are rewarded for producing nutrient-rich foods and consumers have this easily available to them. Today I'm joined by the inspiring Dr Gundi Rhoades, a pioneering regenerative vet who's connecting the dots that many never knew existed. In this two-part conversation, Gundi unpacks how historical choices and technological progress have disrupted the delicate balance of soil microbes and nutrient cycles, contributing to a rise in disease, autoimmune conditions, anxiety and depression. She shares her eye-opening discovery that bacteria and fungi aren't just background players. They're fundamental to producing minerals, amino acids and vitamins vital to animal and human health. Prepare for a conversation that reframes wellness from the ground up. Hello, Gundi. Wonderful to have you on the podcast today.
Hi, Nakala. This is exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. It's wonderful to have you here in our part of the world. Gundi, do you want to just give yourself a bit of an introduction I guess, where did you start being involved in soil health and your veterinary experience? And you're not even from Australia. Start from the start.
Yes, I was born in Germany and my education was there. And I'm not from the land. I'm from a city, from the most industrial part of the planet that you could possibly think of. That's where I'm from. And from when I was little, I just wanted to get onto the land. I had that uncle that had a dairy farm and where I used to like to be. And so whenever I could get out, I would. And then I studied really hard and, got into vet school because I loved science, I loved nature, and I always had animals around me, so ended up in vet school and became a veterinarian. And then spent a few years in England as a vet learning the basics and the ropes. And I met my husband over there and he was a cattle farmer from Australia. So I thought, that sounds like good fun, like I come over. And so I ended up on this Angus bull breeding operation in northern New South Wales on the land. And the rest is sort of history. I had 3 children and I founded my own vet clinic along the way, which is now been going for 23 years. And so I did cows, cattle, mixed practice vetting, like doing, as a vet, you do pretty much in the country, you do everything, like you do cats and dogs and cows, sheep, goats, horses. And so within the 23 years, I did internal medicine, ophthalmology, dentistry, reproduction, orthopedics, So as a vet, we get a pretty good big picture of health and body, because we just fix things all the time. And that's, that in that little town, it's called Inverell in northern New South Wales. That's where I've been working, for the last 20 odd years and just being on the land, but then also in my clinic, and doing clinical work.
So when did you start moving into the soil health environmental area?
Yeah, probably when I was 20. And the instigator of all of this was my mum getting cancer. She had breast cancer, and she went on to, so I have to thank her in a way for that, because she started to ask the question, why did I get cancer in the first place? And she discovered that our food system was broken then. And
20 years ago.
Yeah, 40 years ago.
Wow.
40 years ago, she found that out already. And there was a book by a doctor, Dr. Brucker. He was a doctor in Germany, and he already talked about allergies. So this is in the mid 80s, yeah. So he talked about the broken down food system, about the danger of seed oils, like of rapeseed, canola, and margarines, and how we have extracted the flour, for example. Like flour is not the whole wheat grain anymore, because we take all the good fatty acids out, and we take the germ of the wheat out so that it lasts longer in a warehouse. Yeah, and so he explored what happens when we are now nutrient deficient, because we don't even get the whole nutrition from the bread that we always used to have through history, through the last 10,000 years. So that was, so I was 20 and I'm now nearly 60. So it's a journey of 40 years of learning, and during that time I kept looking at food, and what has happened to food. And then during the last 20 odd years in my clinic, suddenly you see the shift, like of health and disease in people. When I was young, for example, like in the, let's say, the early 80s, there was no child, no classmate. I think we had one that had asthma, one of them, like there was nobody that I knew of that had autism. ADHD was not known. You had a few little kids that were more physical than others, but not like nowadays. We saw, can't remember when it was, like 90s, Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise in Rain Man, the movie. And that was like, oh my God, isn't that interesting? Autism, what is that? Now, nowadays, you talk to people, everybody knows what autism is. And
Has been touched by it as well.
And has been touched by it. And, like most families that come through my door, when they start talking as a vet, people tell you their stories, like they don't have any, there's no big boundary, or like people just talk, which is lovely, like not like when they are at a doctor where it's a bit more formal, like with us vets, you just get the story. And it's like nearly every second, every third family that says, oh yeah, and my son has got autism, or blah, blah, so it is so prevalent nowadays, and it's really striking how the health of the people has gone down. Then endometriosis, I came across, I think I had 3 kids, like just had them, no problem. And then my young nurses suddenly said, oh, I can't have children, I've got endometriosis. And this is like, what is endometriosis? Like none of us had either been diagnosed or had, when we were young, with endometriosis or polycystic ovaries. Then, of course, the obesity is really so noticeable, especially in a little country town, how many overweight people there are. And then I would see people in my consult room that come with their dogs, and they would say, and I would, let's say, diagnose a dog with diabetes. And they said, oh yeah, I know all about that because I have it too, or my wife has it too, And so it's like, oh wow, so the amount of people with diabetes, is amazing. And then Hashimoto's disease in young women, never heard of that when I was young, So you could say, did we just get better at diagnosing? Or is there something that actually has happened, And it took me really a long time to find all of those connections and get to grips with it. But it is noticeable. And I think we all know that, don't we? Like nowadays, as a mother, how many school notes do you have to sign? Like, does your child have an allergy? Does it have asthma? Does it have behavioral problems? None of that really existed, like 40, 50 years ago. So what actually happened, And so 2018 and 19, my district and all of Australia was in this bad drought, yeah, and the fires we will never forget, and I had farmers literally in my clinic bursting out into tears, because their cows got bogged, or they, in the last bit of water in the dams, they had to shoot them, they couldn't sell them anymore, the wildlife that came in, into the clinic, the koalas that were dehydrated in kidney failure and then died in the clinic. It was just horrendous, if you remember that.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
my garden on the farm that used to be so beautiful, and I planted so much and it was all dead, and it just literally broke my heart. The dust storms, the suffering, the shops closing, the birds literally falling from the sky, like the kids on telly, on like being in the water behind the boat because the beach was burning, like it was horrendous, So then I started to think, what's happening here on this planet, and yes, so there we have climate change in my district was you were not allowed to say that it's human induced, like it's
Yes.
National Party, Barnaby Joyce's backyard, and I was like very tempted to not talk about it, but I thought, no, I think we humans have got something to do with this, and of course the arguments is like, no, we've always had hot and cold. And then like being a biologist and being on the farm and knowing quite a lot about climate and ecosystems in the whole, down to the biochemistry of the individual, I thought, no, this is not right. Something has happened, and we probably can't. Let's assume we can't put 350 million tons of stored underground carbon back into the atmosphere within 100 years and not expect a change, of radiated heat. But then it went further. And I started to write a book, which is called The Food Solution, and you can get it on Amazon. It's an attempt. I've never written a book before, so it's a learning curve. But trying to get these pieces of the puzzle together, the different dots. So you've got the chronic disease, the individual and society on one hand. Simultaneously, you have got a climate with extremes, flooding and droughts and fires getting out of balance, like really hitting hard. Then we have got species extinction, where suddenly 75% of insects are gone. And insects are often looked at as pests or mosquitoes, and we don't really want them. But insects are the bottom of the food chain. They're actually the first little animals, like we have plants, the plant kingdom, and then we have got the first eaters of plants are insects, and then the birds and the snakes and the frogs, and then the whole food pyramid really relies on insects. So 75% of them are gone. You drive around for 1,000 kilometers, you won't have one insect on your windscreen. And when I was a kid, we used to stop and scrape them off, yeah? So the shifting norm, the shifting baseline. Then you hear about the oceans, about the big dead zones, you hear about fish decline. Then you get pictures of millions of fish dead in the Menindee. Plus, all the Alzheimer's, the Hashimoto's, the cancers, the arthritis, the autoimmune diseases, all at once. So then I thought, I started writing this book, about whole foods. And then sooner or later, you discover the soil. And you think, oh my goodness, what has happened here? Like, yes, we know about chemicals in your bathroom or in your kitchen, like maybe be a bit more environmentally friendly there. Like then we know about plastics, like and endocrine disruptors from there. And it still didn't touch it. And when I finally discovered what is actually happening on farming soils, see, I was a cattle farmer, an Angus cattle farmer. So we don't do much chemically, on a farm. Yeah. We don't even have to really worm them because the cows and their worms are pretty much in balance, and if in doubt, me as a vet, I would go and take a fecal float and count the eggs, and oh yeah, no, they're okay, so you can get away as a cattle farmer, without many chemicals at all. And When we stopped breeding bulls, that was just a family saga, that unfolded. So we stopped breeding bulls, and then I thought, well, might as well go organic, with my farm. And we had at that time 3,500 acres left, so became organic, read the organic standards and learned what organic meant, and then what the soil had to do with it. And I still wasn't there, it was only really all clicked when I started to learn about chemicals in farming and how we produce food nowadays. I thought, yes, we're eating too much sugar and too many starches, which we definitely do, and yes, margarine is not good for you. And, the whole medical story of don't eat animal fats, which we can talk about another day maybe. But it really fell all into place when I looked at what's happening to how we produce food and what chemicals actually do. And then the dots started to connect.
Yeah, that's amazing. You've actually looked at all of these different angles. You're not just focusing on soil. You're looking at the waterways. You're looking at human health. You're looking at animal health and the soil. It's I'm very interested to read your book again. What's it called?
The food solution,
Yeah. And you also have a podcast called The Regenerative Vet, which I'm really enjoying. So thank you, Gundi, for just being so aware of all of this. As a vet, you're actually more aware of the people than the actual animals. Are you seeing any of the same thing happen in the animals as well with all of these degenerative diseases?
Yes, we do. And actually not so much in ruminants or horses, because they are often still eating what they should be eating, unless they go into a feedlot and they get pretty sick in there, in my opinion. But cows on grass, when the soil is healthy, so when a farmer hasn't done a lot of cropping on his farm, cows are pretty good, because they have got their own rumen, they make their own nutrients, and they can be very healthy. But in the dogs and cats, you see bad nutrition happening, like arthritis, which for a long time I just thought, oh yeah, everybody gets arthritis, until I cottoned on, oh no, maybe this has got something to do with what we eat as well. Ear problems, most vets we treat ear problems all the time. Yeah, like why? Why do ears get so inflamed? Food, it comes back to food. Allergies, like you can either give an immune modulating injection, which we have nowadays, for $150 or $200 a month, or you could look at, and that's what I like to do. Why is this in the first place? Rather than treating symptoms, what is the actual true etiology? And I think we as vets are very trained in looking at the real reason why something happened. Like why, whilst in, I think the medical industry, let's call it an industry, has gone very much to treating symptoms and not really looking where does it come from. So in my research that I did in all of these years, I found there is actually the reason for disease. Why do you have diabetes? What are you eating? Yeah, people didn't used to have diabetes. Like I remember about 15 years ago listening to something where there was a big conference about diabetes, and they said, we're predicting so many more. Nobody talked. I listened to this conference for 4 hours. Nobody talked about why do we have so much diabetes. It was just like, we have an avalanche of diabetes. How can we produce more insulin? Yeah, like diabetes is a starch sugar related disease. End of story. Yeah, very simple. Get off the starches and your diabetes will probably all make yourself better again. And the horses, you're into horses. Where do we have that in horses? If you feed horses too many starches, yeah, they will, and they put on too much fat, and they have got a big neck, with too much fat, or those ponies, that have got so much fat, and they get equine metabolic syndrome. They have got hyperglycemia, too much sugar. Where does that come from? From the starches that we feed them. And sometimes they can get it also because, if they're on really green grass and lots of sugars in that, they can get it from that too. Yeah, but the principle of that is the same in a horse or in a person. You have got all of this fat the fat, the adipocytes, make blockers of the insulin receptors. Yeah. So then the body tries to get that blood sugar down and pushes more and more and more insulin out. And more your receptors are got blocked. And then bang, you get eventually you get an injection every day with more insulin. Just stop eating so much of the starches and the sugars. So it's nutrition is really the core thing of health. And in the olden days, like let's just go back 50,000 years, when there were about 4 million people roaming in the steppes of Africa. We were hunters and gatherers. We were really strong. We were really healthy. And then 10,000 years ago, we started farming wheat, and then our population exploded. Sapiens is a really good book, where this Israeli professor just put this all into one book called Sapiens. Like how we started farming wheat, our population exploded, and then suddenly we are 8 billion people. And about 50 years ago, that's when it really started to go wrong. Maybe 100 years ago, when we started to extract flour to make it last longer in warehouses, and we took the germ off. With that germ, we lost all the B vitamins and the minerals, and that's where disease started. And then after the Second World War, when we started to grow food with chemicals, that's when it really started. And we had this conversation yesterday, like where I said plastic seemed a really good thing at the time, when my God, what can you do with plastics? Like you can make it into any shape and form. Isn't that wonderful? And then 50 years later, suddenly oh my God, we can't get rid of this stuff. And I think farming was the same. We had it seemed such a good idea. Our yields increased, and suddenly we grew double as much. And yay, like we can produce all of this food for these people. And then suddenly now we are waking up. Oh my God, we actually have got in America, 93% of Americans are chronically sick. In Australia, the statistics were on the radio the other day. More than 50% of Australian children are chronically sick. Why? Is it just what we eat, or is it also how we grow that? And that's where the soil story, what you guys are doing here, all comes in.
Yeah, and then I love that you're not just blaming it only on the soil. It's also on about our decision making, our history, the food processing, our food choices, the plastics. But farming, it's also a solution to all of this, but it's also a problem. So let's talk about the soil. What's happening when we're using chemicals that are disrupting things in the soil and fertilizers? What in your experience is happening?
Yeah, so if you are on the land and you have been cropping and farming, you would have probably noticed that the more chemicals you pour on, the more hard and water repellent your soil gets, which is a huge problem if you take it at scale. Like 40% of all of our land mass on the planet is used for food production. And of that, probably 40% is desertifying. So we're talking huge areas of our planet. And when you go out into space and you look back on planet Earth, and you can see all the area that we have under agriculture, it really matters, like how we farm on the 40% that we have private people in most cases, like growing something, and you add them all together, then you have got a planetary problem or a planetary solution.
40% is big, isn't it?
It's really, really huge, and so what chemical farming has done, it has pretty much destroyed the microbiome of the soil. And when I did my research about where do our nutrients come from, I found that the nutrients must come from the soil and nowhere else. So it's a pretty simple conclusion, but in medicine or in nutrition we talk about fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. Yeah, and of course the main ingredient is from the air: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and then for proteins, nitrogen. They're all from the air. And this is what a lot of nutrition has always said. You just need enough fat, or not even fat. Fat was so vilified for a long time. Now we're finding out that animal fats are actually really healthy. And you can hardly eat enough of them, but we thought that was food and nutrition. And then we thought, oh yeah, we need a few minerals. Fact is, you need every mineral. You need magnesium, calcium, selenium, iodine, cobalt, copper, sodium, chloride, iron, boron, phosphorus, and so forth. You need them all, and you need them all in a form that your body can take it in and absorb it. That's a big thing. So you can't just take a tablet and think that's going to be all right. It has to be in a bioavailable form, and then it has to be in balance. So if you give a dog too much calcium and not enough phosphorus, or too much phosphorus and not enough calcium, you get the balance wrong, and you get rickets or hypercalcemia or hypocalcemia, and we as vets, we see sometimes cases where one mineral is missing. For example, calcium is missing, and you have got a cow with milk fever, and she'll die if you don't give her enough calcium. Or a dog with milk fever, or you have calcium and phosphorus wrong, and the puppy has rickets, and the legs are really bent. Or you don't have enough magnesium, and they get hypomagnesemia, and to start shaking all over. So we see these cases when one mineral is missing, or one nutrient is missing. So we need minerals. They must come from the soil. So how do they get from the soil into the plant, into either you eat the plant, or you eat the animal, or you eat the milk or the butter? How do the rocky minerals?
Doesn't come from a bag?
It doesn't come from a bag. How do they get into the plant? They are pretty solid. They're rocks, So this is where the microbial life comes in. And we have only discovered that probably in the last, I don't know, how long have you been going? Worm farming. You've been farming 30 years,
Yeah.
but the real research about the soil microbiome is still in its infancy, isn't it? Really,
so much we don't know. But I will say 30 years ago that it was the snake oil word was used, but now I have not heard that word in a long time. Like the shift in understanding, I think from the gut microbiome has made a huge shift for people understanding that, oh my gosh, we do need this biology. Yeah. Wow, it's actually cheaper to farm if I have this biology, and I'm actually improving my soil and creating healthy food.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is all connected. And it's always good to put it in a historical perspective, why are you and I making our lives work about this? 200 years ago, before we started farming, we were plowing, but it was still much more natural than it was now. We didn't have any of this. We didn't need to talk about that because nature had actually built up the soils for 3 billion years since life began, and it has just slowly developed into this brilliant system where everything was in balance, and where these biological systems work. And the more you look into it, the more you learn about soil or microbes, or if you get a step deeper, you go into biochemistry. Once you are in a biochemical book, or I've got a poster, on my computer, which is let's say 1 meter by 70 centimeter big, and you need nearly glasses to look at the little names on there. One biochemical process goes into the other, and somewhere there is vitamin B1, and somewhere in there is calcium, and somewhere in there is copper and B6 and B12 and vitamin A and C. Everything is connected. And you take one of those cogs out, and the whole system will fall apart, which we didn't have that until we started really interfering with these biological processes that we didn't even know that they existed.
We were just having that conversation where you have to give the B vitamin, where before the microbes were making that. If the microbes aren't there, this animal needs to have a B vitamin. Yeah.
Yes. So the everybody nowadays knows Barocca pretty much, and who the more health conscious people are, the more supplements you will find in their cupboards. Yeah. Why do we need these supplements? Yeah. And what industry are we feeding with that? But why do we need them in the first place? And then you get these miracle healings. Yeah. Let's say you have got a magnesium deficiency. And magnesium is in about 300 enzymes in your body you need magnesium for. You need it for relaxation of muscles. You need magnesium for relaxation of muscles in your blood vessels, so to lower your blood pressure. You need it for relaxation of your bladder, so you need it for blood vessels in your brain. You need it for cognitive functions of your brain. Muscle cramps, like every sports person knows when you do too much sport, and you get cramps in your calf muscles or in your thighs, oh, I have got lack of magnesium. So you take that magnesium and your problem will be solved. Yeah. But why did you have a magnesium deficiency in the first place? And this is where, how you say, the microbes come in. So what do they do in the soil? They have got a really strong acid around them so that they actually literally dissolve rock. And those microbes were the first life form on Earth. So that they started this sort of 3 and a bit billion years ago when bacteria first developed, and then they suddenly could literally mine, the minerals out of the rock.
Amazing.
That's where they come from. So now you can have a farmer that has got lots of phosphorus or magnesium in their soil, but it's locked up. Yeah, it's not available. Why is it not available? Because the microbes are the ones that must make it available. And so they sort of take them in and then they make them available for the plant. So that is the case for all minerals. And may I just add here that glyphosate, which is meant to be so harmless, that the people that were selling it would even drink it, it's not harmless at all. And we must understand actually what it does, so did we know all of that when we started farming with chemicals? We probably didn't, it just seemed a good idea at the time. And blaming never works, blaming anybody, but information and education works. So what does glyphosate do on the mineral side of things? It chelates the minerals. So chelation with a CH, ELAITION, means hooking up with. So everything that's got a plus, so all the cations, calcium plus, iron plus, magnesium plus.
Most of them.
Yeah, most of them. Selenium plus, iodine is a minus, not so much in soil. But so all the pluses get grabbed by glyphosate in the soil and not let go. So there's one reason why industrially farmed food is mineral deficient, because you might have the minerals in your soil. And I studied soil with Elaine Ingham for a year, so I'm not an expert, but I sort of got the message, that the minerals are quite often in the soil. She says, she goes as far as every bit of earth has got enough minerals in it, and some soils are better than others, some have got more than another. But let's say that they're there always, so if you put glyphosate in and you suddenly lock them out of the system, they cannot go into your plant anymore. Why do we farm? We farm to produce food or fiber, yeah, but mainly food. So the food, if it's nutritious, you eat that, will make you healthy. But if our nutrients have minimized in the last 50 years, you are getting less and less of that. So now you suddenly have to eat, let's say, 50 carrots to get the same minerals out of it that you would have got 50 years ago. Yeah. So that's the minerals. That's one thing. Glyphosate is also an antibiotic. So it's an antibiotic, and this is getting a bit complicated, but we've got to talk about this, what it has to do with the nutrients. So glyphosate blocks the Shiki-Mate pathway, which is a biochemical pathway. And what does that pathway make? It makes building blocks of life for proteins, amino acids, and folates, and if you have folate deficiency, like pregnant women are very aware of having enough folate so that the babies develop properly. Otherwise, neural tube defects and so forth. So it makes the essential amino acids for us. Yeah, and this was then huge discovery that I did. Like when you look into where do these nutrients come from? And let's stick with the amino acids for a while.
Are you calling an amino acid a nutrient?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So an amino acid is, you know proteins, yeah? Your meat, cell membranes, hormones, most biological things are proteins. Proteins, fats, carbohydrates, yeah? Your body, your skin, your eyes, your hormones, your cell membranes, your muscle protein, like it's all proteins. And proteins are like three-dimensional folded structures on your DNA imprint. Yeah. So like if your body wants to have more muscle, your DNA will unfold. Yeah. Your body says, I'm training now, I'm eating good stuff, like I want to build more biceps. So your DNA will fold open and muscle protein will be made in a nutshell. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I've always wondered that DNA, I go foggy in the brain when it says the DNA is involved in that. So explain how that DNA allowed that muscle to build.
Because it's the manual. The DNA is a manual. It's your like IKEA instructions, like put this screw there, and please don't get it wrong, like otherwise your shelf will fall over, so it's a blueprint. And then it gets translated, we call it translated, into protein or into anything else, so the DNA is a blueprint, what to build and how to build it.
And everyone has a different DNA profile.
Yes.
So that would mean that everyone has a different potential. So if two people went to a gym and they were trying to build muscle, one person would build a different muscle profile to another person. Is that a good way to look at it?
That's your DNA, what you're born with, but that's a huge story of how much influence your mind has on all of this as well, But let's stick with the nutrients. So you need the building blocks for these proteins. And there is 20 or 21, so 20 different, let's call it letters of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And they've got different names, tyrosine, phenylalanine, tryptophan, and so forth, glycine. So 20 different ones. And then they get put into strings, like one amino acid. So like a letter into a word, yeah, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So that is called a peptide. And then many peptides together get put into sentences, yeah. So we put words into sentences. And then these peptide strings get then three-dimensionally folded into a book or into a story. And that is your protein. So you need every letter in the alphabet to build your proteins. Yeah?
And you're saying these letters are amino acids.
Yeah, they're called amino acids. Yeah. You can look them up on the, if you punch in an amino acid, chemical formula, you will get them. It's a lot of carbon, a lot of nitrogen, and a little bit of nitrogen, in there. So these are your building blocks, and 8 of them are essential. You might have heard about essential amino acids, or people now say aminos. They don't say acids anymore. And you buy them in a supplement shop. You buy L-glutamate or whatever, and that's
There's
suddenly
some in my cupboard, yeah.
and that's suddenly the wonder drug. Yeah, for everything. Or you buy tyrosine, wonder drug, yeah. Or you buy tryptophan. Oh my God, that works. I gave my mom tryptophan. And she was an insomniac for 20 years. Bang, she gets tryptophan, she can sleep. Yeah. So these 8, are you still with me? It's a bit biochemical, but it's really important, right?
Am. Yep.
So these 8 essential amino acids, your body can't build. You can build your liver, will build 12 of them. So you eat a steak, or you eat minced meat, or something else with protein, an egg, chicken, and your body will take that, digest it, and make Nakala's biceps out of it. Yeah.
I need more eggs and meat.
So yeah, that's how it works. But 8 of these building blocks, 8 of the letters, we cannot make. They're essential. And that's when it became really interesting when I did my research. So I was like finding, okay, tryptophan, it's one of these essential amino acids. And we stick with tryptophan because it's such a good one. So tryptophan is made in your tummy, in your colon, if you have gut microbiome, into serotonin. You've heard about serotonin?
Yeah.
Most people nowadays have, yeah? Serotonin is your happy drug, yeah? So tryptophan is made into something called 5-HT, and it's all bacteria needed in these steps, and then it is made into serotonin, and that's your happy drug. And we have an anxiety and depression, like it's overtaking, I don't know how many teenagers are on antidepressants, 40%, 50% of our population is depressed. And this is where my brain starts thinking, what if this is a biochemical deficiency rather than we can't cope with this life, or, the young ones are not resilient enough and they should just pull their socks up, like those sort of thoughts.
We haven't been strict enough on them.
Yeah,
we haven't pushed them hard enough.
Like what if our nutrients are broken down? And they are, this is not hypothetical. This is actually what's happening. So tryptophan is a building block for melatonin, which makes you sleep. Yeah. Tryptophan is also, and these are not complicated proteins. They are really just tryptophan and put a couple of, no big long chains and 3 folding, just put a little bit other things on there, and you've got a very simple molecule, but that molecule makes you happy. Yeah, it's serotonin. And now we get prescribed serotonin uptake inhibitors. Yeah. So they make sure, this is an antidepressant I'm talking about, so now this serotonin made by a tablet will stay in your bloodstream and in your brain a little bit longer to make you happy. So that little bit of serotonin that you might still have now lasts longer. This is how antidepressants work, right? So why do we need them? What's missing? So I find tryptophan is in meat. Yeah, so eat meat, and turkey in particular, and you will get tryptophan from there. And I said, great. And then I read suddenly mammals, like a cow is a mammal and a turkey is a bird, but like animals don't make tryptophan. You're like, oh, right, I thought it came from meat. So then I went further. Where does it come from? Then I found it's made in bacteria and in the plants, and I say maybe in the plants, like you find, and so this sort of detective work I did for every single B vitamin, B1, B2, B3, B6, B12, for not all, but some amino acids. And every time I did it, I got back to they are made by E. coli, by this bacterium, by archaea, by bacteria, and maybe by fungi.
Thanks for tuning in to part 1 of the Microbe Solution with Gundi Rhoades. Next month, join us for part 2 as we delve deeper into the essential role soil biology plays in nourishing human health, from minerals to vitamins and everything in between. Gundi and I explore how we arrived at this point and how we can restore the vital balance that's been lost. As we always say, farmers are the solution. Please follow the Biological Farming RoundTable podcast. Share it with your friends and networks. I'm Nakala Maddock and I work at Nutrisoil, a liquid biological fertiliser made from a big worm farm whose purpose is to empower farmers to produce life-enriching food.